Thank you everyone for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. I know some of you are regulars and hopefully I'll see you more here in the future. So yes, has anyone heard that term ecosystem services? This one person. Okay, well good. This is all new then, which I'm happy to share this work with you. I'll be talking about ecosystem services in the Oceanic Eastern Tropical Pacific. And the main points that I'll touch on are commercial fisheries, biodiversity, carbon storage, and cultural services. So this is work that I did as part of my PhD, which I recently finished at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Yeah. You're clapping for the finished part, right? And so I'd like to also acknowledge my co-authors and my advisors on this work, which are Dr. Lisa Balance and Dr. Ted Groves. And I'd also like to mention that Ted Groves is an economist, and that was really exciting for me to get to work with both marine biologists, oceanographers, and economists throughout doing this work. So with that, I will jump in with just a quick definition of what ecosystem services are. So they're basically the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. And to give you some examples from the ocean provides a major food source for billions of people around the world, which you probably are aware of, especially if you like to eat seafood. So 4.3 billion people obtain 15% of their animal protein from fish. And a lot of that comes from the ocean. That 125 million metric tons of food per year are what is consumed by people that's coming from the ocean. So the ocean is really important as a food source. The ocean also provides the oxygen that we breathe. How many people in this room knew that? Are you familiar with that idea? A few people, but some people not. So 50% of global primary production, which produces oxygen that we breathe, occurs in the ocean. And this happens from the phytoplankton that are in the ocean primarily. So phytoplankton are the little microscopic algae and other things. And they produce basically every other breath you take. So every other breath you're taking is fueled by the plant life in the ocean. So that makes it pretty important for our lives. The ocean also regulates climate. And if you are familiar with climate science at all, or it's a pretty hot topic in the news these days, the ocean is a big sink for carbon. So already the ocean has absorbed 41% of the fossil fuel emissions that we've put out into the atmosphere. So it's doing that service for us by soaking up the carbon that we emit. The ocean also provides a lot of cultural opportunities, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and maybe that's why you live in Hawaii. So people obviously love to surf. There's, tourism on the ocean, kayaking, scuba diving. There's also spiritual uses like people getting married right next to the ocean. Whale watching is a big draw. So it provides us a lot of what we call these cultural opportunities to enjoy, to kind of connect with nature and enjoy what's out there. Now, in total, in the whole world, marine ecosystem services are worth $50 trillion per year. And that's not a number I just made up. That's a number that has been published in the economic literature. And it's obviously an estimate, but it's an estimate made by people who go through and look at all of the services that the ocean provides all around the world. So that's a lot of money. That's 3 times the US GDP, the value of $50 trillion. And this concept of ecosystem services is important for this other concept that people are talking about, which is ecosystem-based management. Has anyone heard that term before? All right, we got one. Okay, cool. Well, this is new stuff for everybody then. I'm glad. Well, ecosystem-based management, if you're curious to know, it has several main features. And basically in the past, what we've done is we've managed different things, different resources in our ocean, sector by sector, or fish species by fish species, or we look and we say, oh no, the monk seal's endangered, so we focus on protecting the monk seal. But when people talk about ecosystem-based management for our oceans, they're talking about something where you look at a certain place and you figure out what is the ecosystem, where is it? Let's take a holistic approach and consider all the things that occur in that system and all the benefits that we get from it. So it incorporates the human element, but not just in negative ways, not just to say, oh, well, people are putting all this pressure on the ocean and we're destroying it and all that. It incorporates the human element by saying, what do we want as humans, what do we want to get from the ocean? And how do we use the ocean and appreciate it, but also protect it and have it for future generations? So to do this, it requires integrating disciplines. As I mentioned before, economics is an important thing. Also understanding ecology and oceanography is important. And then understanding sociology and people. So there's a lot of different people that would, a lot of different disciplines and experts that would come together to try to put an ecosystem-based management approach into play. And to do it, it's based on science and monitoring something about the system and using indicators to monitor something. And then it has this focus on evaluating impacts that we have on the system and thinking about trade-offs in different ways that we use the system. And ultimately, the goal of an ecosystem-based management approach is to maintain the ecosystem services or benefits, as I mentioned before, that the system provides. Now, so far, EBM, I'll just refer to it as EBM, so that's ecosystem-based management. So far, it's really only been implemented in coastal systems. So those are things like around here, coral reefs. You might try to say, Hanauma Bay is our ecosystem of interest, and we want to try to provide tourist opportunities, but also have the fish and the corals and the turtles be healthy. Mangrove systems, those are also coastal systems where people have tried to put in ecosystem-based management schemes. Also bays and wetlands. Morro Bay in California is an example of where this has been attempted. But those are all coastal examples. They're really close to the shore. And there's been much less emphasis on oceanic systems. And what I mean by that is the systems that are off the continental shelf. They're seaward of that. And those are really, I mean, it's pretty easy to think about why that might be, but they're further offshore, so they're more remote and they're more difficult to study and manage. So they're a much bigger challenge to try to implement an ecosystem-based management approach. So what I did for my research was to focus on these concepts of indicators, measuring something in the ocean to tell us something else about the ecosystem, impacts and trade-offs, and a perfect example of an impact or a trade-off in the ocean is when we have bycatch of sea turtles or whales and dolphins in a fishery. We want the fish and we also want the biodiversity, but sometimes when we fish, it impacts the biodiversity, and then we have to decide what do we really want from the system. So that's a trade-off. And then the last thing that I focused on was this concept of how do you look at ecosystem services, especially for an oceanic system that's sort of abstract, right? When we look at the ocean out there, a lot of people might just see a big blue ocean and they may not know exactly what they're getting from it, what it's providing, and all the different things that are out there, right? It just looks like one big blue ocean. So today I'm just talking about this last point here, the ecosystem services point, but I wanted to give you the context for why I was interested in doing this research. People really recognize that, the open ocean or oceanic systems, they represent most of the area on the earth. And so it's an important thing to think about managing in the future. Now, the study area that I'm talking about today is the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And that area, most of you are probably familiar with. It goes from the US-Mexico border south to about central Peru. And then it follows this whole line, this orange line here, which goes almost out to Hawaii. And it's a huge area, 21 million square kilometers. That's about the size of North America. But it is an ecosystem, and it has attributes that, especially with top predators like tunas, whales, dolphins, seabirds, that connect it all as one large oceanic system. So the ETP, I'll call the Eastern Tropical Pacific the ETP, it's really an ideal system for trying this EBM approach and implementing some of these concepts for EBM. And the reason that is, so you can see here all the different countries involved. There are several of them. These lines on the map are the exclusive economic zones that extend out 200 nautical miles from any coast. And that, if you're not familiar with that term, that basically is the area connected with that country. And so they have the rights to manage that area and say the fish and other things within that zone. So the ETP has a number of challenges and also opportunities that make it a good system for applying these concepts of EBM. And those, as I mentioned, there's 12 different countries that have exclusive economic zones there. And then it also includes this area, which we call the Oceanic Commons, that is outside all of those zones. But it has a lot of fish and other resources there that these countries and other countries are using. So the question is, how do we move forward in the future with a better management scheme that is sustainable? The resources within this area are what we call transboundary. So they're highly mobile species such as whales, dolphins, fish, seabirds, turtles. So they can move across political boundaries. And then there's currently some fisheries regulation that spans different political boundaries. So in the blue here, I've outlined this whole area is managed by the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, or IATTC, and they're responsible for managing and conserving fish stocks in the region, especially tunas and swordfish and things like that. So they already have this agreement where all the countries work together to figure out what the limits to fishing should be and how to keep fishing going into the future. So that exists, which is a good thing to build upon. But the idea is we don't want to just look at the fish, we want to look at everything that's there. So there's been significant human influence in this area over time, and that's especially with regard to fisheries. This has been a really productive area for fisheries over the past 100 years. And because of that, we know a lot about the oceanography and about the fisheries and about the biology there. Because a lot of money has actually been put into studying this area. So relative to other oceanic ecosystems, we know quite a bit about the ETP. And I'll tell you a little bit about those data sets here. So one thing that we've learned is a lot about the physical oceanography. And what we have here is that the physical oceanography produces a heterogeneous habitat. So it's producing this habitat that has lots of different features. So what we have here, I'll just highlight a few of these. In the east here, we have this warm tropical surface water called the Eastern Pacific Warm Pool. And there are some species that like that Eastern Pacific Warm Pool area. And then there are other areas that are cooler, and there's a lot of upwelling of nutrients from deeper in the ocean up to the surface. And those are really what we call really productive areas of the ocean. So they're bringing lots of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and things that the phytoplankton need to grow. And then the phytoplankton go up the food chain. So you've got phytoplankton and then zooplankton and fish and whales and so on. So you've got these different areas. So you've got green are these cooler spots, and then red are the warmer spots. Now, as I mentioned before, there have been really productive commercial fisheries in this area for over 100 years. But they've been really good for the last, say, 50 years or so, 50 or 60 years. And what this map shows here is just the extent of how much fishing has occurred. These little blocks here are broken up into, I think, 1 degree latitude, longitude cells. And what it shows here is just you look at the black, and there's a lot more, there's a lot darker shading in the middle, but there's still this gray shading elsewhere. And that's just showing us that fishing is really widespread. And then it has some areas that are really, really big and they catch a lot of fish. And this particular map is only one example of one type of fishing there, but it's the biggest, most popular type of fishing. So this is yellowfin tuna fishing, where they take a big purse seine net and they catch the tuna. Actually, in this example, they encircle dolphins, but I'll talk about that in a second. So there's commercial fisheries that are extensive, and we have a lot of data about those commercial fisheries. Now, in the ETP, purse seine fishing, as I mentioned, has been the biggest form of fishing there since the late 1950s. And are you familiar with purse seine fishing? Is you guys kind of familiar? Well, if you're not, purse seine fishing basically looks like this. You take a large fishing vessel out in the ocean, and you have a big net, and you basically have a little boat. So in this schematic here, you've got the big boat here, and it starts driving away from a certain spot and encircling the fish that it sees. And then you've got this little skiff out here that brings the edge of the net around, and you basically close up the big net and catch what's underneath it. So that's purse seine fishing. And there's three main types of purse seine fishing that are unique to the ETP. This happens all over the world, but having these three different types is a little bit unique. So there's what we call school sets, where the boat goes out, they see a school of tunas. Usually it's big yellowfin tuna. Actually, for the school sets, it's a little bit smaller tuna, but these tunas are just swimming around, and somehow the people on the ship see them, and they go over and they set their purse seine net around the tunas. So that's called school setting, where you just go and set on a school of tunas. There's nothing else around. But then there's something called log sets, and that traditionally there would be floating logs out in the ocean, and the floating logs would aggregate fish underneath them. And so the fishers could go out there and just see these logs floating on the water, and just circle around them and scoop up all the fish below. So those are log sets. And then, who here has heard of dolphin sets before? Yeah, so dolphin set tuna, have you heard of that? Okay, well, I'll tell you more about that in a second. But basically, what they do on dolphin sets is it's really easy from one of these vessels to see dolphins swimming in the water. It's easier to see dolphins than it is to see tunas, a school of tunas swimming in the water. So they would spot the dolphins and then encircle them and catch the tunas below, right? So as you already know, or as you could imagine, setting on dolphins intentionally created a big problem. The idea here might make you a little uncomfortable, and it made people uncomfortable in the past, and so it started this movement to change that practice. So in this fishery in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, over 6 million dolphins were killed by this technique. So that's a lot of dolphins. And as a result of that, the Dolphin Safe label came about, which you've probably all heard of or seen in the supermarket. You can go and buy a can of tuna, and there's the little Dolphin Safe label on there. And the fishery itself started they invented these new techniques to make it so that the dolphins could jump out of the net, and so they wouldn't kill as many dolphins. So that problem has been, more or less solved. The bycatch used to be in the millions, and now each year it's less than, 1,000 dolphins or something like that. There's still a little bycatch, but the problem used to be huge, and they more or less fixed it. But as a result of that, over the years, while they were figuring that problem out, NOAA Fisheries decided to invest a lot to research that problem and to understand how the fishery was impacting the dolphin populations that it was going out and encircling. So because of that, they did a lot of these cruises, research cruises or research surveys on the big white NOAA ships that you may have seen around here from time to time. So they did 10 different years of surveys, and they would go out for 4 months at a time, and they would study the populations of those dolphins. And they would also collect a lot of other information about seabirds, larval fish, flying fish, turtles, and oceanography. So they used it as an opportunity to really study this ecosystem. And what you see here, these are all the ship tracks. So they basically covered the ETP with survey effort really well. So what we did in this study was to ask, what benefits does the ETP provide? And we have to start with basics here, because we're applying this concept to this old system, but no one's really looked at it in this way before. So we're starting with what are the benefits? And well, the typical way of breaking down and looking at ecosystem services and the different types of them, there's a set kind of framework. And that framework really is to think about provisioning ecosystem services. So those are things that are material goods like food and water. Then there's supporting services, and those support other services and allow them to exist. So those are things like habitat and nutrient cycling. And there's regulating services. So those are things like climate, where climate is regulated, or on land, you might have part of an ecosystem that prevents flooding in a certain area. And then cultural ecosystem services, I mentioned some of those, which are things like, going out and using the ocean for sporting events or surfing, whatever you want, and spiritual uses. So for the ETP, we identified the major services in each of those categories. So those were commercial fisheries, biodiversity, carbon storage, and recreational fisheries. And then our objective here, ideally we want to know how each of these services and how our use of them impacts the other services. So we want to know, how does fishing impact biodiversity? And how does recreational fishing impact commercial fishing, things like that. But before we can get to that point, we really just want to establish some baseline information about the quantity. So how much is out there? The geographic distribution, where are all the services? Are they variable over space and time? The stakeholders, so who cares about any of these? Who's gaining from these services? Who's losing if the services go away? And then we want to know something about economic values, or values that are maybe not necessarily in economic terms. So how do we value these services, and what do they mean for us? Now I'm going to go through each of these and share some of the results that we have from the study. And also, if you have questions at any point, please stop me and just ask them. This is informal here. So first with commercial fisheries, we know sort of the most about commercial fisheries. And as I mentioned before, the IATTC has been collecting data on fisheries in this area for decades, right? So we used two key data sets from the IATTC. One of them gives us information about the historical catch for almost 100 years. And so it tells us things about the catch in metric tons, which you'll see abbreviated as MT here. It tells us what different gear types caught the fish every year, what different species were caught every year and how much, and which countries caught the different fish. So there's really good data to understand what's going on in this fishery over time. And then there's also this data set that we use that is specific to yellowfin tuna, because that's been the top species that's been caught in that area for 5 decades or so. And from that, we have information about the catch for those 3 different types of sets. And then we also have information about how much fishing happened. So it's good to know what we caught, but it's also good to know how much we were out there looking. So we have information about number of days that the boats fished and the number of sets that they made every time they would set on something, whether it was school, log, or dolphin fishing. Now, we analyzed those data in a number of ways, and I'll share some of those with you now. So this is almost 100 years, and by far, yellowfin tuna was the top catch. So 45% of all of the fish caught were yellowfin tuna over all those years, starting in 1918, actually. So it ramped up over time and really hit hard in the 1950s, 1960s. But yeah, we have data going back almost 100 years, which is really cool. And so after yellowfin tuna, skipjack tuna, which you've probably also tried, skipjack tuna makes up 27% of the catch. And then big eye tuna also, which you may have also eaten out here. And then after that, albacore tuna was in the top 4. And you have an assortment after that of tuna-like species and other things. So bonitos, dolphin fishes, or mahi-mahi, swordfish, bluefin tuna, blue marlin, sharks and rays, striped marlins, tunas, and other things, sailfish. And in total, over all those years, the amount of biomass that was taken out of that system in terms of fish that were caught amounted to 28 million metric tons. So 28 million metric tons is a lot. Who can tell me like how much that would be? It's hard to imagine, right? So what I did for myself when I was doing this was to think about it in terms of something else that I was more familiar with. So I put it in terms of elephants. So 28 million metric tons is equivalent to 5.7 million African elephants, and those are the big ones. And so those elephants could stand at the equator in a single file line, elephant to elephant, and they could wrap around the earth 10 times. So that's a lot of elephants. That's a lot of biomass. That's a lot of food for people over that many years. But it's also a lot of biomass that's been removed from that ecosystem. So we want to think about that. And, you know, is that the only thing we want from the system, or what else is going on there? So we analyzed some of the data to look at the catch over time and also the estimated wholesale value, which was something that I researched and calculated. But what we're looking at here is for the top 10 species. So remember I said yellowfin, tuna, skipjack, those ones. So the top 10, we're looking at from 1975 to 2010 here. The catch in here, we're looking at thousands of metric tons. So the catch over time has gone up even since 1975, right? And there's it kind of peaked here in the mid 2000s, and now, you know, it went down. So at some point that catch will stabilize, hopefully at something that's sustainable. The average amount over that time frame, so the last 35 years or so, was 544,000 metric tons. So that's 500,000 metric tons. That's a lot of fish. In total, in the world, I think the marine catch each year is about 80 million metric tons of what's wild capture. So in the grand scheme of things, it's only 500,000 out of 80 million, but it's still a huge area of fish productivity in the world. It's still feeding a lot of people. And so I looked at what that was worth. So every year, what is that fish worth over time? And what I came up with here was, and this was using a different economic data set and combining it with the fish catch data set. But what we see is that the fish value also went up over time, and it ranged from about $1 billion to about $4 billion per year. And that's sort of the value of just the fish being caught and sold to market. The average there was 1.9 billion per year, and then the average price per kilogram was $3.11. I forget the price per pound, but it's not important. So, and those trends have increased over time. So catch has gone up, and the value of fish have gone up over time. And that's something important to know when we think about what do we want from the system, what do we want in the future. So we looked at how who caught the fish basically, and how that mix of who's catching the fish changed over time. What we found was that there were key fishing nations in the area, and those changed over time to where in the past we had the US in black here and Japan in dark blue. They had significant shares of the catch. We were out there catching a lot of fish. And that was historical, but as you notice here, the black, the US catch went down, and also the Japanese catch in that area went down too. So historically you had the US, Mexico, Japan, and Ecuador. And today, really the main fishing nations are Ecuador, Mexico, Venezuela, Panama, and Colombia, which you'll notice these are all countries that are in that area. They're located in that area. And to me, I think that could be important because it might be easier to manage the whole system there, given that these key players are located right there, and you don't have all these external countries coming in that you have to deal with when you think about management. So we looked at the distribution of yellowfin tuna being that top species that's caught, and what we found was that the catch and the landings where they took the fish to all the different ports, that changed over time. But it was really widespread. So all throughout that area, the gray line here is that ETP border that we're looking at. But also there were some concentrated areas. So let me tell you what this map shows here. In yellow, we see the low areas of catch, and in dark blue, we see the high areas of catch. So there's a bit of these sort of hot spots there. And this map over in the lower left, that just shows us where all the fishing occurred. And so it's important to know that, you know, where fishing occurs is going to influence how much fish you catch, but it's not factored into the map here. So when we're looking at this big map, we're just saying where were all the fish caught? The yellowfin tuna. So they were caught a lot right here, which is along the 10-degree north line, and then up here near Baja. So this is off of Central California here. And so you've got these hot spots of catch. And then you also have where the fish were landed. So any country could have caught the fish, but where did they take it to port to sell it? And those by far, those are the orange dots. So the bigger the dot, the more fish are landed there. And those really have hot spots here in Mexico and down in Ecuador. So most of the fish are landed there, which means that there's processing plants there to process the fish and export them out to the rest of the world. So that's all I'm going to say about the commercial fisheries part. But what you'll see is that we're learning a bit about each of these services as we dig into the data sets that already exist and combine them in new ways. So the next thing I'll talk about is biodiversity. And it happens that a third of all of the world's species of cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins, if you aren't familiar with that term. So cetaceans, seabirds, and sea turtles, a third of all the species in each of those categories occur in the ETP. That's a lot. That's a special place for biodiversity. And what I'm showing here, this is a conservation table that shows us the status of these species as deemed by the IUCN Red List, if you've heard of that. And so what we see here is that 17% of cetacean species in the ETP are threatened with extinction to some degree. 26% of the seabird species and 80% of the sea turtle species. Now, for sea turtles, there's only 5 species that occur there, so basically they're all endangered to some degree. But also what we see for cetaceans, you'll notice that seabirds, they have part of their life cycle on land, right? And sea turtles also have part of their life cycle on land. So we know more about those species and the threats that they face. It's a little bit more difficult to study cetaceans, which don't come on land at all. So for 13 of those species, or 43% of the ones in the ETP, there's not enough data to know whether they're threatened with extinction. So there needs to be more work done, and they could be in conservation crisis or not. Now, I just want to remind you of this map before I show you some maps of where the species occur. So remember, we have these areas of upwelling, the green areas. So it's cooler water and upwelling. And it kind of goes along the equator here, just along it and north of it, and then off of Baja and off of Peru. There's also this feature called the Costa Rica Dome, where cool water comes to the surface. There's not actually a seamount or anything under there. It's just an oceanographic feature, but it collects a lot of animals. And then around that is this warm pool. So I just wanted to remind you of this because I'll show you some maps now about where the species occur for some of these top predators, we would call them. This first map here shows what we were able to quantify for cetaceans. So we quantified species richness, which is just the number of species in any given location. And that's a metric of biodiversity. So we're interested in quantifying biodiversity. So we were able to take the data from those NOAA fisheries research cruises and turn them into, on those cruises, they look and they see where all of the animals are. They write it down. They record the number of animals, the species type, and where it occurred. So we have really good data on that. And what we see here is that there are some hot spots of where the number of cetacean species is the highest. So this dark blue number here is 12 to 16 species can be found in these locations. So you see off Baja here, That's really high for total number of species. Over here, that surrounded by that, surrounding that Costa Rica dome feature that I mentioned, there's a lot of species in that area and kind of along the 10-degree line here. And then also over here off of the Panama Bight. So a lot of species there. And also they overlap with the commercial fisheries. So it happens that we're getting a lot of fish there, but there's also a lot of species that a lot of people probably want to survive. And what are those species? This is this is exciting for me because in Hawaii here, you see all of these same species. So I'm talking about the Eastern Tropical Pacific today, but it's really so it has a lot of the same species, but it's what we'd call a more productive area. So if you go out on a research cruise around here, you might see one group of whales or dolphins per day, maybe up to 5 groups per day. But when you're out there in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, you see a lot of the same species, but you see way more of them per day. So does anyone know what these are? Anyone want to take a guess at any of them? You all know this one, right? So we have killer whales. Anyone know this? Anyone want to guess? Sperm whale. Do you know these? Pilot whales. We have those here. This one, anyone? So this is a baleen whale. This is called Bruda's whale. What about this one? Biggest animal on the planet. Blue whale. We have bottlenose dolphins there, striped dolphins, spotted dolphins, eastern spinner dolphins, Rizzo's dolphins, rough-toothed dolphins, and short-beaked common dolphins. So lots of species there, and really cool that they're the same ones that you would see out here. Now for seabirds, do we have any seabird fans here in the audience? I'm a big seabird fan, so I always like to meet the seabird fans. So for seabirds, we saw similarly that there were several different areas that we may call hotspots. So a lot of different species occur here. And if you'll notice, the number of species is way higher. So 28 to 38 in this case. And also what you see is that there's overlap with the commercial fisheries in a couple different spots, right? So that can be an issue sometimes. The fishers often use seabirds as indicators of where the fish are. So it helps them fish, but then sometimes there's bycatch and other things happening. So what are those seabirds? Okay. These are all species right here that also occur in Hawaii. And they happen to all be photos that I took in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands at Laysan Island. So we've got brown noddies, black-footed albatross, sooty terns, frigate birds, red-footed boobies, masked boobies, white terns, Laysan albatross, sooty shearwaters, red-tailed tropic birds, and brown boobies. And these are just examples of some of those species, as were the cetaceans. These are not all of them. There are a lot of cool birds there that go to the ETP to eat. And then we also had specimens collected for larval species, and mostly these are larval fishes, but they also include squids and octopus and things like that. And what we see here is that the hotspots are largely restricted to the coastal areas, so that's where these larval specimens were collected. But they do occur all throughout. It's just that they're in higher concentration of species here along the coast. And there's a little bit of overlap with the commercial fisheries, but, you know, would that matter? I don't know. Probably it's not going to be affected by commercial fishing. For some examples of the fish that were collected, does anyone, are you fish people in the room? Anyone a fish fan? Okay, well, this is really cool. Have you seen flying fish around here? Yes. Yeah, so flying fish are really cool. The first time I saw one, I thought it was the neatest thing. Flying fish and flying fish relatives here. I'm not a fish person, so I can't tell you all the names of these, but I do know these are all flying fish relatives, mullets. These are mahi-mahis. We've got our yellowfin tuna here, another tuna-related species. This is a purple-back flying squid that I actually collected here off of Hawaii. And then some deep sea fishes. These are myctophids and stomiiforms. And I think one of the upcoming lectures, or the whole month of August, is going to be deep sea. So maybe you'll hear about deep sea fish at some point. And what we did for turtles, our data were different for turtles because when we're on the big research vessels there, we don't see all of the species. We mostly see olive ridley turtles. So rather than look at the number of species, we looked at the density of sightings. So where did we see all of the turtles? And the turtles were mostly olive ridleys. So where we saw them was off of southern Mexico, off of Guatemala, and off of Costa Rica, which is really cool because that's where there are these nesting beaches for olive ridley turtles. And those, there's not a lot of overlap showing here with the commercial fishing, but these data are kind of different and limited. And we do know that there is turtle bycatch in the fisheries in that area. But, this map is not intended to point out those connections. But what I do want to point out is that, has anyone heard of the olive ridley arribada? Anyone? Wait, okay, so sea turtles normally just come up on the beach and they nest one at a time, and you don't get hundreds to thousands on a beach at one time. But with the olive ridley turtles, you do. And so those beaches I pointed out in Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, the olive ridley turtles come up on the beaches and they nest. They'll take up a couple miles of a beach and they'll have thousands of turtles coming up over a few nights. And so it's crazy. And these are pictures that I took down at the beach in Costa Rica when I was working there. So these turtles are just making these tractor tracks along the sand. They look like, these tracks. So the beach, you walk out in the morning after one of these events is happening and the beach is just all messed up. And so also for some of the work that I did down there, we sort of rescued some of the hatchlings that were on the beach and did some studies with them, and then we're able to release them back into the water there. So that's an important, the reason I bring this up is just because it's an important place for biodiversity, and people tend to care about turtles, and they're down there in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. So who, other than us, care about the biodiversity in the ETP? Well, there's lots of NGOs and government agencies working on understanding and protecting biodiversity, specifically in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. So it's recognized as an important place. Those research surveys I talked about, NOAA invested over $50 million already in those surveys over a couple of decades, or maybe 3 decades. And then there have been tens of millions of dollars invested by other research, conservation, protected area organizations over time. So, the fisheries are worth a lot, but so is biodiversity. And just to give you a couple of examples of tourism there, in the Galapagos, a lot of those seabird species and a lot of the cetacean species and a lot of the fishing, it's all near the Galapagos, and some people go there to enjoy those species, right? And so 80,000 tourists a year go to the Galapagos, and they bring in $140 million. So that's not, that's not nothing. That's pretty significant. And whale watching globally, there was a study that came out that said whale watching currently is about worth $2 billion around the world. And that's projected to increase to almost $3 billion in the next few years. So as I mentioned, a third of the world's cetacean species are in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, and people are going there to enjoy them. Now, I'm running a little short on time, but I'll just talk a little bit about the last 2 topics. Now, we know less about these, so it's easier to keep them short. What we did for carbon storage and understanding this idea of carbon storage was apply a couple of different thought experiments, we called them. So we know that what I said before, the ocean's absorbing a lot of our carbon that we put into the atmosphere, 41% of it. What happens to that carbon after it enters the surface of the ocean? Well, a small percentage of it goes from the surface layer through what we call a biological pump down to the deep ocean sediments. It's a small percent, but when you look at a very large area, it's a lot of carbon. And that happens through phytoplankton, zooplankton, and fish fecal pellets. So they all sink down to the bottom. And so a small percentage of that carbon is getting locked away in the deep sea for thousands of years on a time scale that is relevant when we think about where carbon is going these days. So it kind of takes it out of play. But so currently that's sort of a free ecosystem service, right? We don't have to pay for it. But what if we somehow broke the ecosystem and then we had to pay for that carbon storage elsewhere? This is the concept of blue carbon, and we applied it to the ETP. So we estimated the amount of carbon that was going down to the deep ocean and applied a carbon market price. So in Europe, in Europe and in other places around the world, they've got these carbon markets where people are paying, or they're trading their carbon emissions. They only are allowed a certain amount, and there's a price on it. And so that gave us this value of $16.6 billion a year. Now, that's just completely an estimate. I want to say that right now. It's a conservative estimate that we did using a conservative amount of carbon that's exported. But what I want to remind you about is that we're not sure how much biodiversity is worth, and we don't really want to put a price on it. But millions and millions of dollars are being spent to understand it, protect it, preserve it, to enjoy it through tourism. And then I mentioned through the fishery. In recent years, that fishery was worth $4 billion just for the fish alone. But those numbers are both much smaller than the $16.6 billion. So if somehow, we disrupted the ecosystem and the carbon no longer went down, and we had to figure out where to put that carbon for climate change purposes, well, we might be paying a pretty high price. So it's something to think about. Question?
What's blue carbon used for?
The idea of blue carbon, what is it used for? So it's basically, it's easier to think about in terms of, say, a mangrove forest. So down in Mexico, or say Guam, I think has mangroves. In a coastal area, mangroves, any kind of plant grows. Actually, it's easier to think about for a rainforest. So in rainforests, the trees grow rapidly and they soak up carbon, because the way they photosynthesize is to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and release oxygen for us to breathe. So trees in a forest take up a lot of carbon dioxide and they grow. And they say if you leave that tree there for 1,000 years, that tree is going to store the carbon. We're using the same idea here, but there's no tree. It's the ocean that's taking the carbon and storing it. So the idea is that we don't want the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere because it's warming our planet.
Well, how is it released then into use?
Oh, we don't want it released.
Never.
Well, the idea that I'm talking about here is taking the carbon and storing it somewhere so that it's not released, so that we can take it out of the atmosphere. And this is a natural process that occurs in rainforests. I'm not talking about any sort of engineering or anything like that. I'm purely talking about what the system already does. So it takes the carbon, and the carbon ends up, in animal bodies and fecal pellets and stuff like that in the sediments on the seafloor. And then eventually it kind of gets to a place where it's locked down there, and the ocean doesn't let it up for thousands and thousands of years. And for our purposes, that effectively is taking carbon dioxide out of our lower atmosphere, which is warming. Does that answer your question? So this idea is abstract, I know, but it's the same idea as storing carbon in trees and paying people to not cut down those trees, because when they cut down those trees, they're releasing the carbon to the atmosphere. It's weird. I know it's a weird concept, but we can talk more about it if you want. This might make a little more sense, sort of. It's not as abstract, but the other thing here is our major impact in the ETP has been to remove a lot of fish and remove a lot of dolphins. So if we think about what amount of carbon is in those fish and what amount of carbon is in those dolphins, this is just another sort of thought experiment to say, how much carbon is there removed from the fish every year? And if we left those fish in the system, how much would that be worth? Versus if we take them out and sell them, how much is that worth? So we can the idea is to look at the amount of carbon that you would leave in the ocean through different means and see how much that carbon would be worth. So here it looked like, every year the fish would be worth only $2 million to leave in the ocean. But as you saw earlier, the average value of the fishery by taking the fish out is something more like $2 billion to $4 billion a year. So it's not really worth leaving, monetarily, it's not worth leaving the fish in the ocean just to keep the carbon in there. And then similarly for the dolphins, it was only worth collectively about $2 million to look at the amount of carbon that we basically took out of the ocean over all those years by killing those 6 million dolphins and reducing the size of the population. So as I mentioned, these were thought experiments. So that's why a lot of you may look perplexed, because they're sort of weird ideas. But the idea is to think about, again, these different services that this oceanic ecosystem are providing for us. So it's providing fish, it's providing biodiversity, and it's also providing this concept of carbon storage. And it's taking it and locking it away in different things, whether they're animals or the deep ocean sediments. And then last here, recreational fishing, or sport fishing mainly, has been on the rise in the ETP for last 50 years. And what we've seen, they're mostly fishing for the same stuff they're fishing for here, which is billfish, marlin, sailfish, swordfish, and tunas. So across Los Cabos, Mexico, Costa Rica, and Panama, the total expenditures on sport fishing for people who want to go on a big fishing trip and stay there, and they pay money, to stay in the resort and then pay money to go on the boat. That was about $1.2 billion per year based on these recent economic studies. What I found interesting is that there's a trend going from north to south. Most of the tourists who are going there are Americans and Canadians. And so first we hit Los Cabos, Mexico, and thought that was really cool. And then people thought, oh, we want to go further south and catch more fish. And there's this, secret fishing spot. So now they went to Costa Rica. And then, now it's getting big in Panama, and it's even now getting big in Ecuador. So $1.2 billion a year is a lot of money just in 3 spots. And there's more spots in that area. And then recall that the commercial fishing was worth, the fish there are worth anywhere between $2 and $4 billion a year currently. So those hotspots also overlap with the commercial fishing catch hotspots. And they also overlap with, I put this on the cetacean species map. So over here in this area near Baja, we've got a lot of cetacean species. We've got sport fishing, and we've also got commercial fishing. They're all hotspots. Down here off of Costa Rica, same thing, cetacean species, commercial fishing, and also sport fishing, and also same thing down here off Panama. So it's good to know where there's co-occurrence of these different services that we want to make sustainable into the future. So now, just to wrap up here, we asked this question: what benefits or ecosystem services does the Eastern Tropical Pacific provide? And so what we did was we learned a bit about these different services, and we learned different things about them. So it's more difficult to understand value for biodiversity. So we can understand what people are investing and what people are, spending to enjoy biodiversity, but we don't necessarily know how much the value is. It's easier to do that for commercial fisheries. For recreational fisheries, I think that's this one over here. We learned some different things. So the point is that we're using these different data sets and trying to understand the different services of this oceanic system. And we know more about some of the services than we do for others. Now, why is this important? It just highlights the variety of services provided by an open ocean system. And it makes us think about the ETP in a new way, because traditionally we've mostly thought about it for the benefits we get from tuna fisheries. So we've provided some understanding of those services. And most importantly, we've set the stage for further analyses to understand trade-offs and how we use these different services. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much. And I'll take questions. Question?
What did you say blue carbon is again?
So the idea of blue carbon is that carbon from the atmosphere is taken up by the ocean. Now, mostly we think of blue carbon in coastal systems like mangroves, and you can Google blue carbon. If you Google the blue carbon on the internet, you'll see lots of different things popping up, and most of them will talk about mangroves, coral reefs, things that are close to shore and have a combination of plant and animal life that takes in the carbon and stores it within the ecosystem so that that carbon is not out in the atmosphere. So it's the drawdown of carbon by natural ecosystems. And it's something that occurs if we keep these ecosystems intact. And so if you destroy a mangrove forest, you're releasing all that carbon. If you preserve it, you're keeping that carbon there, and you're also providing habitat and things like that. So it's similar to the idea of rainforests keeping carbon in that contained area. It's a hot new topic.
So whereas the carbon in the ocean, that's not called blue carbon?
It is called blue carbon, but the concept of blue carbon is this idea of humans protecting ecosystems so that they can continue to do their natural function of storing carbon and not having it all out in the atmosphere.
This carbon you're talking about comes from our coal or fuel or gasoline.
That's right. There's a natural amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then there's carbon. Like every time we, drive our cars, we're burning fossil fuels. So those fossil fuels used to be animal life that had carbon. So when we put the gasoline in our cars, and when it's at energy plants, coal-fired power plants, we're burning something that is full of carbon because it used to be an animal. And that carbon then is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And the natural cycle on Earth is for plants and phytoplankton in the ocean to breathe in carbon dioxide and then to release oxygen, which we use to breathe. So that's sort of the natural cycle. And there's already carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but when we release fossil fuels to produce energy and then drive our cars, that's releasing it back into the atmosphere. So we took it from oil that was in the seafloor, that was from the carbon going down and being stored in the deep ocean sediments and below that, and then we just put it back out into the atmosphere.
So 200-mile economic zone.
Yeah.
I mean, can you speak of it?
Sure.
And is there any push to increase it?
Oh, is there a push to increase it? Okay, that's an interesting question. I don't know currently if there's a push to increase it, but I do know historically it started as, I think, only a 50-mile zone or something. And then somewhat recently, maybe, don't quote me on this, but say, they started doing this in the 60s or 70s. In the 80s or 90s, they increased it to 200 miles. So over time, countries recognized that they wanted more exclusive access to the resources that were further out. And sometimes 200 miles is sort of corresponds to the continental shelf, but then other times the continental shelf is way closer. So I don't know if they would ever change that, because so many people around the world are interested in fishing and other things on the high seas. So I don't know that countries are going to have success in increasing it.
I would say yes, they're going to expand it for our own military defense.
Oh, that's a good point. I should look into that. It gets interesting, like in Southeast Asia and in Micronesia and those areas. When you put a 200-mile border around, sometimes your neighbor's 200 miles right there. So you don't get 200 miles, you get the difference. You split the difference, which is interesting. Yeah. So you want it to be increased.
But it's economically driven.
Yeah.
You're going to have that.
Yeah.
Incentive to push.
Yeah. Right now on the high seas, anyone can do whatever they want. So there's, if one country says we're going to expand it, then all the other countries might say, no, we don't want to do that, because they're used to going right outside everyone else's EEZs and getting to do whatever they want. It's a good
Right
question.
now, nobody owns the fish. See?
Yeah, nobody owns the fish.
It's free for them.
Yeah, that's right. Which is a problem, which is why I was interested in studying something that's very difficult to do, but we need to push forward for better types of management in the open ocean. And I hope what you've gained from this is to understand that we actually know quite a bit about some of these large oceanic systems. And so it's to our advantage to understand them and use these data sets to really push forward and put new tools out there that can help us better manage the systems.
Or understand what value.
Yeah, and understand what value. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. I hope to see you back here at another talk.